As you may or may not already know, just the other day I posted a video comparing complex villains to pure evil ones. And my original plan was to talk about Darth Vader in that video as well, before deciding that he both needed and deserved a video of his own. But in case you're now curious, a link to the other video can be found in the description below. Okay, so in that video, I was mainly talking about great villains with very simple motivations. But today, I'd like to discuss who I believe to be one of the greatest complex villains ever, Darth Vader, as well as argue for why his redemption is a deserved one. So, with all that being said, let's get into it. Alright, so there have been many arguments over the years of whether or not Vader slash Anakin actually deserved to be forgiven at the end of Return of the Jedi. Now, I firmly say he should, and will state my case as to why that is. And just to reinforce what I'm saying, there's this one quote arguing against his redemption in particular that I'm going to be counter-arguing as well. With that quote being, since Vader, there have been countless similar villains that have been accused of being too unsympathetic, getting off scot-free, and promoting toxic ideas about family or one's ability to save the ones they love. More fleshed out redemption arcs have also exposed how relatively minimal Vader's is by comparison, and the oddness of why saving his son apparently made him pull a complete personality and ideological 180. Now, personally, I think whoever wrote that doesn't understand Star Wars at all, but I'll get back to that quote in a minute. First, I want to compare Vader to another villain who actually has a lot in common with him that gets an undisputed perfect redemption. And that's Doc Ock from Spider-Man 2. And yes, in this case, I'll only be talking about Spider-Man 2 here. No other appearances will be taken into account. And there will be spoilers ahead, so you might just want to click off now if you don't want anything ruined. Now, also considered one of the greatest sympathetic villains of all time, Doc Ock is a great man with an absolute genius who ends up having mechanical arms fused to his back in an experiment gone wrong, and in the process the arms also corrupt his mind and essentially take it over. So, under the influence of the arm's manipulations, Ock goes on a rampage, determined to get revenge on Spider-Man and rebuild his reactor at all costs, not caring in the slightest who gets hurt or dies because of it. But at the very end, just before his reactor is going to destroy New York City, Peter Parker manages to remind Doc of the man he used to be, allowing him to finally break free of the AI controlling him, and dies destroying the reactor he had spent the whole movie trying to build, determined to redeem himself for his earlier actions at the cost of his life. It really is a great villain story, and deserves all the recognition it gets. But you notice how nobody ever complains that his redemption was problematic or undeserved? And that's simply because it isn't. It's made obvious that the ARM's AI are the real problem, and it's Ock's ability to overcome them and do what's right that solidifies he earns his redemption. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is, when you really look at it, Vader has almost the exact same story. He also was a great and extremely gifted man who was led astray and corrupted by an evil force, causing him to do awful things before his son reminds him of the man he used to be and finally overcoming that force to do what's right at the cost of his own life. And what some people really don't understand is, in Star Wars, the Force is real. Its influence over those who can use it is real. And there's a very good reason why the Jedi are so afraid of the dark side of the Force, because it's really not much different from the AI that corrupts Doc Ock. In fact, it's a million times worse. Imagine if there was something in the real world that not only gave you power, but also gave you a massive high and feeling of satisfaction every time you used it. But as a result, it corrupts your mind to make you believe that all the evil you're doing is a good thing and makes you take active pleasure in it. That is the dark side of the Force. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, in Star Wars, when you turn to the dark side of the Force, it destroys the person you are and turns you into a being of absolute evil with only a loose connection to the man you once were. Now, you could also argue that he shouldn't have turned in the first place, because he chose to, whereas with Doc Ock it was an accident. But the thing is, normally I'd agree with you. However, when you stop and really look at everything he'd been through, between a war, the Jedi losing their way, which makes Anakin mistrust them, and the Emperor's manipulations, it was never really his choice. Yes, he still did choose to turn on Mace Windu, but the way everything had been going since he was 9 years old, if you ask me, that decision was made long before that moment came, and not by Anakin himself either. But again, yes, he didn't have to make that choice. But realistically, I'd say he was doomed before that moment ever came, both because of the Jedi's poor decisions and the Emperor's very calculated manipulations. Oh, and maybe that wasn't conveyed in the movies as well as it could have, but I still think that's exactly what George Lucas had in mind when that moment came. And then by the time of Return of the Jedi, Luke actually manages to get Anakin to come through for a minute, and we see that he's become a broken, disillusioned old man who knows exactly what he's become, but resigns himself to it because he believes you can never break free from the dark side of the Force. Of course, his later actions would prove that wrong, and that's the main reason why he deserves to be forgiven. Think about it. With some help from Luke, he managed to break free of a force of pure evil that had been clouding his mind for decades, compelling him to do horrible things under the justification that he was in the right, and giving him immense pleasure from doing it. He was able to do what nobody had done before, free himself from its influence and put back whatever was left of the great man he used to be. And that's the man he dies as. Not the evil, monstrous man the dark side had turned him into and the Emperor had tricked him into becoming, but the great hero he had been, just like Doc Ock did at the end of his movie. Now, what I'm getting at here is that quote I mentioned at the start has it all wrong. Anakin most certainly is not unsympathetic when you look at all the circumstances that led him to the dark side, and he most certainly didn't get off scot-free either. His turn to the dark side cost him everything he ever cared about, literally an arm and a leg, and made him spend the rest of his life in almost perpetual pain. Even once he breaks free, his decision to kill the Emperor ends up costing him his life. So he most certainly paid for his fall to the dark side. And to call his redemption minimal is frankly ridiculous, since the prequels and Clone Wars TV series dedicated almost everything to setting him up as a sympathetic character and foreshadowing his fall and redemption. So not only is it extremely fleshed out, but very well earned at that. And finally, there's that part about his decision to save his son, sparking an ideological 180. Now, that I feel is the part that really exposes just how little they know about Star Wars. Because as I just went over, in Star Wars, the Force is real, and to switch from one side to the other is a complete personality and ideological 180 in and of itself. The two sides are a complete opposite of each other. You want proof? Look no further than Revenge of the Sith. One moment Anakin is extremely remorseful over causing Mace Windu's death, but a few minutes later, as soon as he switches to the dark side, he suddenly sees all Jedi as pure evil and slaughters them without hesitation. Again, it all just goes to show how quickly the dark side corrupts and destroys you as soon as you turn to it. Now as for him saving Luke, when he decides to save him and turn on the Emperor, that's what finally allows him to turn from the dark side and come back to the light side. So if we're following what happened in Revenge of the Sith and what I said about the dark side earlier, isn't it only the logical outcome that his personality and morals would change almost instantly? And what only reinforces that is right before he dies, Luke says he's going to save him, and he only replies, "You already have, Luke." He's basically telling him outright that he saved him from the dark side of the Force, which had been corrupting, destroying, and influencing him for over 20 years. And the moment he decided to save Luke, he was finally able to reject all of that, allowing him to become the man he was once more and see things clearly again. So, as I said, the 180 thing makes complete sense in the context of the story. Now, lastly, there's what it says about family, which I do believe is a little trickier. Because I will be the first person to say that, no, sometimes not even family can save a person. Family can't always redeem somebody, especially if they don't want to be redeemed. But the thing is, I feel that sometimes people take these movies too much at face value because the moral of the story isn't simply children can always save their parents. Because when you look at the prequels, you get to see that Anakin is very passionate when it comes to the people he cares about, and that's how the Emperor gets him to fall to the dark side. Then, almost immediately, he loses everybody, making him believe he has nobody left but the Emperor, who over the years reveals himself to be an extremely cruel, uncaring, and evil man. But then 20 years later, not only does he find out he has a son, possibly the last connection he has to the woman he cared about more than anything, but that same son is giving him a chance that even he believes he doesn't deserve, but at the same time so desperately needs. So within the story, it makes sense why Luke is able to help Anakin redeem himself. Now, I still do agree that it wouldn't be the best moral, but as I said before, that's not the moral they're trying to convey. Star Wars has plenty of morals in it, yes, but children can always help their parents redeem themselves no matter what is not one of them, and that's not what people should be taking away from it. There's a major difference between story elements, such as Anakin's passion for those he loves and how it affects the story, and that same story's morals. To bring up that comparison again, Peter Parker was able to redeem Doc by appealing to his better nature, and even though they're not related by blood, they still have a history together, and he's still taking the same chance as Luke. And in both cases, it just happens to pay off. Okay, I think I've made my point quite clear about that quote. But to be completely fair, let's look at it from people who make more solid arguments about why Anakin shouldn't be forgiven. Now, I guess the main point of contention here is, should Anakin be held responsible for Vader's actions? Now, everybody will have a different stand on that, but from a legal standpoint, the answer would probably be a straight yes. However, from a moral one, I think it's a lot more complicated, because he was really thoroughly used and manipulated into falling to the dark side, and from there it destroyed who he was. As I said before, I really would equate it to the AI that corrupts Doc Ock, only much worse. Of course, the main difference between the two villains is Ock doesn't do anything nearly as bad as Vader while under the influence of the arms, and when he finally does break free, he takes responsibility for what he did, whether he really should or not. But the other difference here is that Ock created the arms himself and knew there was some sort of risk when he used them, which may also partially explain why he feels responsible for his actions. In the case of Anakin, though, I would say he is partially responsible for what he does as Vader, but that the dark side and the Emperor are mostly to blame, and his ability to finally turn from the dark side easily eclipses any responsibility that falls on Anakin's shoulders personally. And he's not even looking for forgiveness or redemption from the whole galaxy, just his son and to a lesser extent his fellow Jedi, who are really the only ones he cares about at that point, as well as understand the significance of what he'd just done. And that's why I believe the story works as is. Maybe his redemption isn't exactly applicable to real life, but within the context of the story, I believe it's actually done really well. But of course, I could be wrong. And I know there are plenty of people out there who will say I'm completely wrong about everything I just said, and I'm honestly okay with that. I understand stuff like this can be very hard to dissect and draw conclusions from, so I'm just trying to do the best I can with the information made available. And if you disagree with me, that's fine. Because I also get that everybody will have a different take on the assessment I just made, and yours may be just as right as mine or anybody else's. But I still feel that when you look at the story as is, Anakin slash Darth Vader really does deserve the title as one of the best sympathetic villains of all time. And if you ask me, the actual scene where he redeems himself may just be not only one of the best scenes in Star Wars, but in all of cinema as well. Okay, that pretty much wraps everything up. But now it's your turn to tell me. Do you believe that Anakin is the perfect redemption story, or do you believe he shouldn't have been forgiven? Please feel free to talk about it in the comments. But please let's stick to lightsabers. We don't need any blasters in the conversation. So uncivilized. But bad jokes aside, let's try to keep it light. I only want to start a conversation, not a brawl. And thank you all for watching. I always greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.